Samuel Little. Some people vanish without a trace, their names lost to time. For decades, America barely noticed. How many lives can disappear before someone starts asking questions? Samuel Little understood this silence better than anyone, and he used it to become the deadliest serial killer in United States history. From 1970 to 2005, Little moved across the nation like a shadow, taking lives in at least 19 states. The FBI eventually confirmed he was responsible for more than 60 murders, though he confessed to 93. Unlike killers who sought fame or left deliberate clues, Little chose his targets carefully from society's margins. He knew which deaths would barely register, which bodies would go unidentified, which families had no voice loud enough to demand justice. Samuel Little was born Samuel McDowell on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia. His childhood offered little stability. Raised primarily by his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio, after his mother reportedly abandoned him, Little dropped out of high school and began drifting. By 1975, he had been arrested 26 times across 11 states for theft, assault, fraud, and attempted rape. Yet he consistently evaded serious consequences, serving only short sentences before moving on to the next city, the next crime, the next opportunity. His murders began on New Year's Eve in 1970 in Miami. He would later describe the experience to law enforcement with chilling simplicity, comparing it to addiction. Over the following 35 years, Little refined his approach. He targeted women who lived on society's edges, often working as prostitutes or struggling with drug addiction. These were people whose disappearances rarely triggered extensive investigations, whose deaths were frequently misclassified as overdoses or attributed to natural causes. Little's method remained consistent. He would meet women in bars, on street corners, or in areas where desperation made trust a luxury few could afford. After gaining their confidence, he would take them to isolated locations, empty houses, or abandoned buildings. There, he would overpower them, using his hands to end their lives. What made his crimes particularly difficult to solve was that many victims' bodies were never found, and those that were discovered showed few obvious signs pointing to homicide. Multiple autopsy reports listed causes like drug overdose or undetermined circumstances, allowing Little to continue undetected year after year. In October 1984, San Diego police stumbled upon Little attacking a woman in his car. She survived and testified against him. Prosecutors believed they had caught a dangerous predator, but the jury declined to convict on the most serious charges. Little served just 2.5 years before walking free in February 1987. Within months, he had moved to Los Angeles and resumed killing. At least 10 more women died during this period, their cases joining hundreds of other unsolved homicides in a city overwhelmed by crime. The pattern continued because America's justice system failed to connect the dots. Investigators in Mississippi suspected Little of murder in 1982 but couldn't secure an indictment. Florida tried him for another killing that same year, but he was acquitted in January 1984. Multiple law enforcement agencies noticed troubling patterns. Some even contacted the FBI, yet no coordinated investigation emerged. Little remained free, drifting from state to state, leaving bodies and broken families in his wake. His luck finally changed on September 5, 2012. Police arrested him at a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky, on an outstanding narcotics charge. When California authorities received his DNA sample, they made connections that had eluded investigators for decades. The evidence linked Little to 3 Los Angeles murders from the late 1980s: Linda, Alfred, Audrey Everett, and Guadalupe Apodaca. In 2014, at age 74, Little was convicted and sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. Most killers maintain their innocence or minimize their crimes. Little did neither. In May 2018, Texas Ranger James Holland began interviewing him about an unrelated case. What followed astonished law enforcement nationwide. Over roughly 700 hours of conversations, Little confessed to murder after murder, providing details only the killer could know. He described where he met each victim, how they looked, what they wore, where he left their bodies. His memory proved remarkably accurate for locations and faces, though he struggled with precise dates and distances. To help investigators, Little drew detailed sketches of his victims, creating haunting portraits from memory decades after their deaths. The FBI posted these drawings online, hoping families might recognize lost loved ones. The strategy worked. Case after case that had gone cold for 30 or 40 years suddenly found resolution. Families who had never stopped searching finally learned what happened to their daughters, sisters, and mothers. Little died on December 30th, 2020, in a California medical facility at age 80. He never expressed genuine remorse for his actions, though he claimed he wanted to help exonerate any innocent people imprisoned for his crimes. As of today, investigators continue matching his confessions to unsolved cases, bringing closure to families who waited decades for answers. His story forces uncomfortable questions about how society values certain lives over others. Why did so many deaths go uninvestigated? How did one man kill for 35 years without being stopped? The answers reveal systemic failures that allowed Samuel Little to become America's most prolific serial killer, not through brilliance or luck, but through society's willingness to overlook the forgotten. Lonnie David Franklin Jr., the grim sleeper. A neighbor waves from the driveway. He fixes your car for half the price of a mechanic. You see him every day, going to work at the sanitation department. Could this ordinary man, in South Central Los Angeles, be responsible for decades of terror? Could someone this familiar, this unremarkable, hide such a dark secret in plain sight? Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was born on August 30th, 1952, and spent his entire life in South Central Los Angeles. He married, fathered 2 children, and built a reputation as the helpful guy on the block who could get your vehicle running again. Neighbors described him as friendly and quiet, someone who chatted while working on cars in his front yard. Nothing about his outward appearance suggested danger, but beneath this ordinary exterior lay something far darker that would eventually earn him one of the most haunting nicknames in American crime history. Franklin's pattern of violence began long before anyone in Los Angeles knew to be afraid. In April 1974, while stationed with the United States Army in Stuttgart, Germany, he and 2 other servicemen approached a 17-year-old girl walking to the train station after midnight. They asked for directions, offered her a ride home, and when she accepted, they held a knife to her throat. The 3 men drove her to a remote location and repeatedly assaulted her. They even photographed the attack, a disturbing practice Franklin would continue throughout his life. The victim showed remarkable courage by pretending interest in one of the attackers and asking for his phone number. That detail led police directly to Franklin. He received a prison sentence of 3 years and 4 months from a German court and was dishonorably discharged from the military in July 1975. Despite this conviction, Franklin returned to Los Angeles and rebuilt his life. He found work with the city's sanitation department, got married, and settled into what appeared to be a normal existence. But starting in August 1985, women in South Central began disappearing. The first confirmed victim was Deborah Jackson, whose body was found in a trash-filled alley. Then came Henrietta Wright, Barbara Ware, Bonita Sparks, and others. All were young black women, many struggling with addiction or working as prostitutes. Franklin understood that society often overlooked these women, that their disappearances wouldn't generate the same urgency as other cases. Franklin's approach remained consistent. He would encounter women on the streets near his home, gain their confidence, lure them into his vehicle, and then end their lives. He used a .25 caliber semi-automatic handgun in most cases. After taking their lives, he dumped their bodies in alleys and near trash bins, sometimes mere blocks from where he lived. The Los Angeles Police Department found themselves investigating multiple cases that seemed connected by ballistics and location, yet they struggled to identify a suspect. In November 1988, Franklin made his first known mistake. Enietra Washington got into his car, and like the others, she found herself in a nightmare situation. He shot her in the chest while they sat in his vehicle, then pushed her from the car, believing she was gone, but Washington survived. She stumbled into a nearby business and provided investigators with a description of her attacker and details about his orange Pinto. This was the break detectives needed, yet somehow Franklin avoided capture. Then something remarkable happened. The attacks simply stopped. For 13 years, no new cases emerged that matched the pattern. Investigators wondered if their suspect had died, moved away, or been imprisoned for other crimes. Some theorized he had stopped entirely. But in March 2002, Princess Berthamew's body was discovered in an Inglewood alleyway. 17 months later, Valerie McCorvey suffered the same fate. The same gun Franklin had used in the 1980s was responsible for these new deaths. He had never actually stopped. The gap in confirmed cases gave him his nickname, the Grim Sleeper. The case remained frustrating and unsolved until 2007, when investigators tried something new. They ran a familial DNA search through California's criminal database, looking not for exact matches but for genetic similarities that might point to a relative of their suspect. They found Christopher Franklin, who had been arrested on a weapons charge. Christopher was too young to have committed the 80s murders, but his father fit the timeline perfectly. In July 2010, detectives began surveillance on Lonnie Franklin. They needed his DNA to confirm their suspicions. An undercover officer posed as a busboy at a family gathering in Orange County and collected items Franklin had touched, including a partially eaten slice of pizza. The DNA extracted from that pizza crust matched evidence from multiple crime scenes. On July 7, 2010, Franklin was arrested at his home. The search of his property revealed something that shocked even experienced detectives. Hidden in his garage were over 1,000 photographs and several hundred hours of video, showing women, some unconscious, some in compromising positions. Many remained unidentified even after police released the images to the public, asking for help in determining who these women were and whether they had become victims. Franklin's trial began in February 2016, after years of legal delays. On May 5, 2016, a jury found him responsible for 9 murders and 1 attempted murder. 3 months later, on August 10th, the court sentenced him to the ultimate punishment. He was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, where he joined hundreds of others awaiting their fate. But Franklin never faced that final consequence. On March 28, 2020, corrections officers found him unresponsive in his cell. He was 67 years old. Authorities declared his passing appeared natural, with no signs of trauma. The true number of his victims died with him that evening, leaving families without complete answers and communities without full closure. Today, investigators continue working to identify women from Franklin's photographs. His story stands as a reminder that danger doesn't always announce itself, and sometimes the most ordinary person carries the darkest secrets. Anthony Sowell. Neighbors blamed the sausage factory. Day after day, month after month, that unbearable odor hung over Imperial Avenue in Cleveland. Residents complained to the health department. They covered their noses when they walked past certain houses. They discussed it at block meetings and community gatherings. But what if the real source wasn't a business processing meat? What if the truth was so much worse that an entire neighborhood had been living next door to something unspeakable? Anthony Edward Sowell was born on August 19, 1959, in East Cleveland, Ohio. His early years were marked by circumstances no child should endure. Growing up in a household where violence was routine and safety was never guaranteed. Yet despite this troubled beginning, Sowell managed to join the United States Marine Corps in 1978. He served honorably for 7 years, rising to the rank of sergeant before receiving an honorable discharge in 1985. To those who knew him during this period, he seemed like someone who had overcome difficult circumstances and built a respectable life. But the veneer of normalcy concealed darker impulses. In 1990, Sowell pleaded guilty to attempted rape and received a 15-year prison sentence. During his incarceration, he was considered a model inmate, causing no significant trouble and quietly serving his time. On June 20, 2005, he walked out of prison a free man. The state classified him as a registered offender, but he returned to the same Cleveland neighborhood where he had grown up. To his neighbors, he appeared to be simply another resident, trying to rebuild his life after serving his debt to society. Sowell moved into a home on Imperial Avenue in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood. He collected scrap metal to earn money and stayed mostly to himself. Those who interacted with him described someone who seemed ordinary, perhaps a bit quiet, but not threatening. He played chess with neighbors. He helped fix things around the community. Nobody suspected that behind the walls of his modest 2-story home, something unspeakable was beginning to unfold. Starting in May 2007, women began disappearing from the surrounding area. Crystal Dozier, a 35-year-old mother of 7 children, vanished first. Her family filed a missing person report and searched desperately for answers. Then came Tishana Culver, followed by others. Michelle Mason, Kim Smith, Nancy Cobbs. One after another, women from the neighborhood simply disappeared. Most struggled with addiction. Some worked on the streets. Their families reported them missing, posted flyers, called hospitals, and begged police to investigate. But too often, authorities dismissed their concerns, suggesting these women would return when they were ready. Meanwhile, that terrible smell continued to worsen. Residents of Imperial Avenue grew increasingly frustrated. They assumed the odor originated from Ray's Sausage Company, a meat processing business located nearby. The health department received multiple complaints, but inspections of the facility found no violations. The smell persisted, and the community learned to live with it, never imagining the real source of that stench. The truth emerged on October 29, 2009. Police arrived at Sowell's home to arrest him on charges related to an attack that had occurred weeks earlier. A woman named Latundra Billups had survived an encounter with Sowell and eventually reported what happened to authorities. When officers entered the house to execute the arrest warrant, they immediately noticed an overwhelming odor. Within minutes, they discovered something that would shock not just Cleveland, but the entire nation. The remains of 2 women were found in the 3rd-floor attic. Police obtained additional search warrants and continued their investigation of the property. By the time they finished, they had recovered the bodies of 11 women from inside the house and buried in the backyard. Some remains were hidden in crawl spaces. Others were concealed in garbage bags. One victim was found in the basement. The house, and for years, nobody had known. The investigation revealed that Sowell had lured his victims with promises of drugs or alcohol. Once inside his home, he would attack them and end their lives. He kept their remains on his property, sometimes for months or even years. The stench that neighbors had blamed on a sausage factory was actually the smell of decomposition drifting from Sowell's house. Sowell was charged with 11 counts of murder, along with numerous other offenses, including kidnapping and tampering with evidence. During police interrogations, he claimed to hear voices telling him to hurt certain women. He described himself as someone who would black out and later have no memory of his actions. The court rejected his attempts to claim insanity. His trial began in June 2011. On July 22nd, a jury found him responsible for all 11 deaths. 2 months later, on September 15th, the court imposed the ultimate penalty. Anthony Sowell was transferred to the Chillicothe Correctional Institution to await his fate. He never faced that final day. On January 21st, 2021, officials transferred him to a medical facility in Columbus after he developed a terminal illness. He passed away on February 8, 2021, at the age of 61. The city demolished his house in December 2011, and a memorial garden now stands on that site to honor his victims. The case of Anthony Sowell exposed painful failures in how society responds when marginalized people disappear. It revealed how easily someone can hide terrible acts when their victims are dismissed as unimportant. And it reminded an entire city that sometimes the most ordinary neighbor can be hiding the darkest secrets. Charles Cullen. When you trust someone with your life, do you ever question that decision? In hospitals across America, patients place absolute faith in the people wearing scrubs, believing that every injection, every medication, and every touch is meant to heal. But what happens when that trust becomes a weapon? What happens when the person sworn to protect you decides, in the quiet darkness of a night shift, to do the opposite? Charles Edmund Cullen was born on February 22, 1960, in West Orange, New Jersey, the youngest of 8 children. His father, a bus driver, passed away when Charles was only 7 months old, leaving the family struggling financially and emotionally. By the time he reached 16, his mother had also died following a car accident, leaving him an orphan while still in high school. 2 of his siblings would also pass away during his youth. For someone so young, Charles Cullen had already experienced more loss than most people witness in a lifetime. Some who knew him during those years remember a quiet, withdrawn teenager who seemed to carry an invisible weight. After dropping out of high school in 1978, Cullen enlisted in the United States Navy, perhaps hoping to find structure and purpose. But his time in the military was marked by concerning behavior and multiple attempts to harm himself. He was discharged in 1984 and soon after enrolled at Mountainside Hospital School of Nursing in Montclair, New Jersey. By 1987, he had earned his nursing license and began working at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston. To his colleagues, he appeared competent and dedicated. To the patients in his care, he seemed like any other healthcare professional. Nobody suspected that within a year of starting his career, Charles Cullen would commit his first act of harm. In June 1988, Cullen administered a lethal overdose of medication to a patient at St. Barnabas. It was the beginning of what would become one of the most extensive series of healthcare-related deaths in American history. Over the next 16 years, Cullen would work at 9 different hospitals and 1 nursing home across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. At each facility, he followed a similar pattern. Working predominantly night shifts when supervision was minimal, he would enter patients' rooms and inject deadly doses of digoxin, insulin, and other medications into their intravenous lines. Some victims were elderly, others were recovering from surgery, some were seriously ill, while others were on the path to recovery. Age, diagnosis, and prognosis seemed to matter little in his selection process. What made Cullen so difficult to catch was the environment itself. In intensive care units and cardiac wards, unexpected deaths occur regularly. The administration of powerful medications is routine. When patients died on Cullen's shifts, their passing often appeared to be natural complications of their existing conditions. Medical staff might note an unusual number of deaths, but without obvious signs of harm. Most cases were never investigated as potential crimes. Even when hospital administrators grew suspicious enough to launch internal reviews, they often chose to simply let Cullen resign, rather than report him to authorities or flag his record. This pattern of quiet dismissal allowed him to move seamlessly from one institution to another, carrying his deadly habits with him. By 2002, Cullen had relocated to Somerset Medical Center in New Jersey, where he would claim the majority of his confirmed victims. It was here that a fellow nurse named Amy Loughran began noticing disturbing patterns. Patients were dying unexpectedly on shifts when Cullen worked. Medications were going missing. When one patient, Reverend Florian Goll, died suddenly in June 2003, investigators finally began connecting dots that should have been connected years earlier. Hospital records showed unauthorized access to medication supplies. Toxicology reports revealed substances that shouldn't have been in patient systems. The evidence was pointing unmistakably toward Charles Cullen. Detectives needed a confession, and they turned to Loughran for help. Despite her own serious heart condition and the risk involved, she agreed to wear a recording device and meet with Cullen outside of work. In conversations that would later prove crucial to the investigation, she gently confronted him about the deaths. Though he never gave a clear confession on tape, his evasive responses and emotional reactions provided investigators with enough cause to make an arrest. On December 12, 2003, police took Charles Cullen into custody. What followed was a series of interviews that shocked even experienced homicide detectives. Cullen admitted to ending the lives of approximately 40 patients, though he struggled to remember exact numbers or specific dates. He claimed his actions were motivated by mercy, insisting he was relieving suffering. Yet investigators noted that many of his victims were not terminally ill and were actually improving. His explanation felt hollow, especially given the calculated nature of his actions and the years spent evading detection. In April 2004, Cullen pleaded guilty to the crimes. At his sentencing in March 2006, victims' families finally had the opportunity to confront the man who had destroyed their lives. They called him a monster, a coward, and worse. Cullen sat silently at the defense table, appearing almost disconnected from the proceedings. The court sentenced him to 11 consecutive life terms, without the possibility of parole, totaling 397 years. He would never again be free. As of January 2026, Charles Edmund Cullen is 65 years old and remains imprisoned at New Jersey State Prison. The true number of his victims may never be known. Researchers have suggested the total could reach 400 people, which would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in world history. His case exposed catastrophic failures in how hospitals handle suspicious staff members and forced changes in how medical facilities report and investigate unusual patient deaths. For the families still searching for answers about loved ones who died during Cullen's shifts, the question remains haunting and unanswerable. Did their family member's death truly result from their illness? Or was it something far darker? Robert Hansen, the butcher baker. Picture the most successful hunter in your neighborhood. Someone with trophies on the wall. Someone who knows every inch of the wilderness. Now imagine he's decided the greatest game isn't out there in the forest anymore. What happens when the person everyone trusts with a rifle decides that animals no longer satisfy the urge? What happens when a baker starts hunting something that can scream? Robert Christian Hansen was born on February 15, 1939, in Estherville, Iowa. His father, a Danish immigrant, ran a local bakery with an iron fist and expected perfection. Robert worked long hours, kneading dough and serving customers from an early age. He also endured relentless torment. His stutter made speaking difficult. His acne covered his face. His slight frame and buck teeth made him a target for classmates who found cruelty entertaining. Rejection became the soundtrack to his adolescence, and those wounds never truly healed. Instead, they festered into something darker. Hansen found solace in hunting. Alone in the woods of Iowa, tracking deer with a rifle, he finally felt powerful. Animals didn't mock him. They didn't laugh at his stutter. They simply ran, and he controlled whether they lived or perished. By his late teens, Hansen had become an exceptional marksman and tracker. But hunting game wasn't enough to ease his bitterness toward a world that had rejected him. In 1960, at age 21, he convinced a teenage employee at his father's bakery to help him burn down the local school bus garage. His reasoning was simple: revenge against people he believed had wronged him. When the teenager confessed and implicated Hansen, he was arrested and sentenced to 3 years in prison, though he served only 20 months. After his release, Hansen drifted between petty crimes and brief jail stays before marrying for the second time in 1963. 4 years later, in 1967, he and his wife relocated to Anchorage, Alaska, drawn by the promise of opportunity during the pipeline boom years. Hansen opened his own bakery downtown and became a fixture in the community. Customers knew him as Bob the Baker, a mild-mannered businessman who made quality bread and pastries. Police officers stopped by regularly for coffee and donuts. Neighbors considered him friendly, if a bit reserved. He and his wife raised 2 children in what appeared to be a stable, normal household. But Alaska offered Hansen something Iowa never could: vast, isolated wilderness where a man could disappear for days without raising suspicion. He became an accomplished big-game hunter, setting local records for his kills. Trophy animals decorated his home, proof of his skill and patience. Nobody questioned why he spent so many hours alone in the bush. Nobody wondered what else he might be hunting out there. Starting in the early 1970s, women in Anchorage began vanishing. Most worked as dancers or engaged in activities that made them vulnerable. Hansen would approach them in his car, offering money for companionship. Once they accepted, he would drive them to his home, where a soundproofed room waited. After assaulting them, he faced a choice. Some women he released back into Anchorage, warning them that nobody would believe their accusations against a respected business owner. He was right. When a few did report him, police dismissed their claims. How could Bob the Baker, the stuttering family man who sold bread to half the city, be capable of such things? But other women never returned to Anchorage at all. Hansen would load them into his small bush plane and fly them to remote areas near the Knik River. There, in the vast Alaskan wilderness, he would release them and give them a head start. Then he would hunt them with the same rifle he used for big game, tracking them through the trees until he could take his shot. Their bodies were buried in shallow graves on sandbars, marked carefully on an aviation map Hansen kept hidden in the headboard of his bed. Each X represented a kill. Each X was a person who would never go home. For over a decade, Hansen operated with near impunity. His position in the community protected him. His choice of victims ensured minimal investigation. Alaska's wilderness concealed the evidence. But on June 13, 1983, everything changed when a young woman named Cindy Paulson escaped. She flagged down a passing motorist while still handcuffed, hysterical, and barely clothed. Her account seemed almost too horrifying to believe. She described being chained in a man's home, assaulted repeatedly, then driven to a small airstrip where she managed to flee while her captor loaded his plane. She identified both the plane and its owner, Robert Hansen. When police searched Hansen's home, they found the aviation map with 24X marks. They found jewelry belonging to missing women. They found a .223 caliber rifle that matched bullet casings recovered from crime scenes. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Hansen confessed to 17 murders and admitted to assaulting 30 more women over 12 years. In February 1984, he received a sentence of 461 years plus life without parole. Hansen led investigators to burial sites that summer, helping them recover 12 bodies. The remaining victims have never been found. Some, like Eklutna Annie, remain unidentified to this day. Hansen never showed genuine remorse, later stating he targeted these women because they represented all the people who had rejected him throughout his life. On August 21, 2014, Robert Hansen passed away from natural causes at Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward, Alaska. He was 75 years old. His case inspired numerous films and documentaries, forever cementing his place as one of Alaska's most notorious criminals. The butcher baker had finally stopped hunting, but the families of his victims continue searching for answers that may never come. Gary Michael Hilton. Thousands of people walk America's forest trails every year seeking peace, solitude, and communion with nature. The trees don't judge. The mountains don't criticize. Out there, away from the chaos of civilization, hikers find something pure. But what if someone else was using those same trails as their hunting ground? What if the gray-haired man with the friendly dog walking past you on the trail had already decided whether you would make it home? Gary Michael Hilton lived in a green Chevrolet Astro van with his dog Dandy, drifting between national forests across the southeastern United States. To fellow hikers, he seemed like just another outdoor enthusiast enjoying retirement. He was polite, knowledgeable about trails, and appeared harmless. But between 2007 and 2008, this unremarkable man would turn some of America's most beautiful wilderness areas into crime scenes that would shock investigators and terrify communities across 3 states. Hilton was born on November 22, 1946, in Atlanta, Georgia. His childhood was marked by tragedy and violence. At age 10, a Murphy bed collapsed on him, causing a severe head injury that required over 200 stitches. The trauma damaged his frontal lobe, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and decision-making. 3 years later, at just 13 years old, Hilton shot his stepfather. Though his stepfather declined to press charges, the incident sent Gary into foster care, setting the stage for a life marked by instability. As a young man, Hilton joined the United States Army and became a capable paratrooper. But his military career ended when he experienced what records describe as a psychiatric episode. After receiving an honorable discharge in 1967, he cycled through 3 marriages, all ending in divorce. His adult life became a pattern of odd jobs, minor crimes, and increasing isolation. By his 60s, Hilton was homeless, living in his van, and moving constantly between national parks and forests. To anyone who noticed him, he was just another transient outdoorsman. Nobody suspected what he was capable of. On October 21, 2007, 80-year-old John Bryant and his 84-year-old wife Irene set out for what should have been a routine hike through Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina. They were experienced hikers who knew the trails well. When they failed to return, and their vehicle was found abandoned, family members reported them missing. A massive search operation involving dozens of volunteers, cadaver dogs, and a helicopter turned up no immediate trace of the couple. Then, investigators discovered something disturbing. Someone had used the Bryant's bank card at an ATM in Tennessee. Surveillance footage showed a man in a yellow jacket, but his hood obscured his face. Weeks later, Irene's body was discovered in the forest. She had been attacked with a blunt object. John remained missing until February 2008, when a hunter stumbled upon his skull in Nantahala National Forest in Georgia. The FBI launched a major investigation, offering a $10,000 reward for information. But before they could piece together what had happened to the Bryants, another case emerged that would eventually crack the investigation wide open. Cheryl Dunlap, a 46-year-old nurse at Florida State University, disappeared on December 1st, 2007. She had gone to Apalachicola National Forest to read and enjoy the peace of nature. When she failed to appear for her Sunday school class the next day, friends and family knew something was wrong. 2 weeks later, hunters discovered her remains in the forest. Investigators found that someone had used her ATM card multiple times in Tallahassee, withdrawing $700. Tips came in about a suspicious green truck driven by a man with a dog, but initially, the case seemed to be an isolated incident. Then came Meredith Emerson. The 24-year-old left a note for her roommate on New Year's Day, 2008, saying she was taking her dog Ella for a hike at Vogel State Park in Georgia. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a man with a dog following Meredith on the trail that day. When she didn't return, a search began immediately. On January 3rd, authorities found her car. The next day, her dog was discovered wandering a parking lot alone, and some of Meredith's belongings, including bloodied clothing, were found in a dumpster. Law enforcement had already issued public appeals asking for information about a man matching a certain description in connection with previous murders. When multiple people reported seeing someone matching that description cleaning a green Astro van at a gas station near Vogel State Park, police responded immediately. On January 5th, 2008, they arrested Gary Michael Hilton. The evidence found in his van was damning. There was blood, there were items belonging to Emerson, and there was a missing rear seat belt that matched one found with her belongings. Hilton eventually confessed to authorities, but only after negotiating deals that would spare his beloved dog Dandy and, in George's case, take away the possibility of execution. He led investigators to Meredith's remains and provided details about his other victims. His admissions revealed a pattern. He would approach hikers, overpower them, hold them captive for days while draining their bank accounts, then end their lives in remote locations where bodies might never be found. Hilton received multiple sentences. Florida gave him the ultimate punishment in 2011. Georgia sentenced him to life with the possibility of parole after 30 years in 2008. North Carolina added 4 life sentences in 2012. Investigators believe he may be responsible for several other unsolved disappearances dating back to the 1990s, including cases that share remarkable similarities to his confirmed crimes. As of January 2026, Gary Michael Hilton remains incarcerated, serving his sentences in Florida. In a recent interview with Court TV, despite years of denials, he finally confessed on camera to one of the murders he had previously contested. His case continues to haunt the families of his victims and serves as a reminder that danger can wear the most ordinary disguises, even on the most peaceful trails. Derrick Todd Lee. DNA is supposed to solve crimes, not start witch hunts. For years, investigators across Louisiana chased shadows based on science that pointed them in the wrong direction. An FBI profile assured them they were hunting a white male. Task forces followed that lead. Resources poured into pursuing the wrong demographic. Meanwhile, the real killer walked freely through Baton Rouge neighborhoods, knocking on doors, flashing that charming smile, asking to borrow a phone. How many lives could have been saved if the science had pointed in the right direction from the start? The story of Derrick Todd Lee exposes uncomfortable questions about trust, assumptions, and the failures that allow danger to thrive. Between 1998 and 2003, someone was targeting women across southern Louisiana with a pattern so clear that investigators knew they had a serial predator on their hands. Yet for years, the very tools meant to catch him instead helped him evade capture. By the time authorities finally identified Lee, At least 7 women had lost their lives, and an entire community had learned to live in constant fear. Derrick Todd Lee was born on November 5, 1968, in Street Francisville, Louisiana, a small town north of Baton Rouge. His childhood was marked by chaos and instability. Lee grew up in a household of 14 siblings, raised primarily by a mother who struggled to maintain control. His biological father battled mental health issues, including bipolar disorder and psychosis, conditions that would echo through the family for generations. By his teenage years, Lee was already showing signs of the person he would become. Burglary arrests came first, followed by assaults. He was building a criminal history, one offense at a time. As an adult, Lee married and had children, presenting an outward appearance of normalcy to his neighbors in Baton Rouge. But his criminal behavior continued escalating. In 1993, he received a sentence of 4 years for burglary. After his release in 1995, he moved to Lake Charles, where he was arrested just 2 months later for peeping into windows. The pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. Lee was obsessed with watching women, learning their routines, studying their homes. These weren't random acts. They were reconnaissance missions. The first confirmed victim connected to Lee was Randy Maybrewer, who disappeared on April 18, 1998. Her 3-year-old son was sleeping in his bedroom when someone abducted her from their home. Investigators found blood throughout the residence, but Maybrewer herself vanished without a trace. Her body has never been recovered. 3 years later, the terror accelerated. On September 24, 2001, 41-year-old Gina Wilson Green was found strangled in her home near Louisiana State University. She had been assaulted, and her body left on her bed after being attacked in her kitchen. Her cell phone was missing, later discovered weeks afterward in a nearby alley. Because the location was so close to LSU, the case generated significant attention among students and faculty. Everyone wanted to know who could do such a thing. Then came Geraldine Barr de Soto on January 14, 2002. The 21-year-old was attacked in her home in Addis. She fought back against her attacker, scratching and clawing with everything she had. Her husband discovered her body when he returned home. Investigators collected DNA from beneath her fingernails, evidence that would eventually prove crucial. Charlotte Murray Pace became perhaps the most well-known victim. On May 31, 2002, the 22-year-old was attacked in her Baton Rouge apartment. She had just graduated from LSU the week before, earning her MBA as one of the youngest recipients in the university's history. She had moved into her new place only 2 days earlier, excited about starting her career. Instead, she was attacked and ended her life after being stabbed 81 times with a screwdriver. The prolonged nature of the attack spoke to the killer's rage and complete lack of humanity. Pam Kinamore followed on July 12, 2002. Trinaisha Dene Cullen was attacked on November 21, 2002. Carrie Lynn Yoder became his final confirmed victim on March 3, 2003. The bodies were piling up, and the community was descending into panic. Women enrolled in self-defense classes. Gun sales surged. People stopped opening their doors to strangers. The entire Baton Rouge area was living under siege. Through all of this, investigators were working with flawed information. FBI profilers had developed an offender profile, suggesting the killer was likely a white male between 25 and 35 years old. Task forces focused their attention on suspects matching this description. DNA evidence seemed to support this theory initially, but the science was wrong, and that mistake cost lives. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. On July 9, 2002, Diane Alexander answered her door in Breaux Bridge to find a man asking to use her phone. She handed him a cordless phone through her partially opened door, trying to be helpful while maintaining caution. The man forced his way inside, overpowered her, and began assaulting her. He beat her and tried to strangle her with a telephone cord. But Alexander's teenage son arrived home from school during the attack, interrupting the assault and causing the attacker to flee. Alexander survived, becoming the only known living victim of the Baton Rouge serial killer. Her description of her attacker finally gave investigators the breakthrough they needed. She described an African-American male, contradicting the FBI profile that had guided the investigation for years. Police in Zachary recognized the description from a recent Peeping Tom case they had investigated. They contacted Baton Rouge authorities and mentioned they had DNA from Lee collected during a previous investigation months earlier. When crime lab technicians compared the DNA samples, everything clicked into place. The DNA matched evidence from multiple crime scenes. Advanced testing revealed the killer was 85% African ancestry, completely contradicting the earlier profile. On May 5, 2003, investigators collected a fresh DNA sample from Lee. The results confirmed what they now suspected. Derrick Todd Lee was the Baton Rouge serial killer. Lee fled to Atlanta, where he found work at a tire shop, hoping to disappear into a new city. But on May 27, 2003, the Atlanta Police Department's fugitive squad arrested him without incident. He was extradited back to Louisiana to face justice. In 2004, separate juries convicted Lee of murdering both Geraldine DeSoto and Charlotte Murray Pace. The DeSoto conviction carried a life sentence. The Pace conviction resulted in a sentence to face the ultimate consequence. Lee never confessed to any of the killings, maintaining his innocence even as the DNA evidence overwhelmingly proved his guilt. He never made it to his final day. On January 21, 2016, while receiving medical care at a Baton Rouge hospital, Derrick Todd Lee passed away from heart disease at age 47. He had spent over a decade on the execution roster, but natural causes intervened before the state could carry out his sentence. The true number of Lee's victims remains unknown. Investigators believe he may be responsible for as many as 17 deaths across Louisiana. His case exposed critical flaws in forensic profiling and reminded law enforcement that assumptions can be deadly. For the families of his victims, his passing brought no real closure, only the knowledge that the man who destroyed their lives would never answer all their questions. Joel Rifkin. A missing license plate changed everything. One small detail, one routine traffic stop. That's all it took to expose the man responsible for 17 deaths across New York. How does someone disappear into plain sight for 4 years? How does a soft-spoken landscaper, living with his mother in a quiet Long Island suburb, become the most prolific serial killer in New York State history? And why did nobody notice until a 20-minute car chase ended with the smell of decomposition drifting from the back of a pickup truck? Joel David Rifkin was born on January 20, 1959, to 2 unmarried college students who placed him for adoption. 3 weeks later, Bernard and Jean Rifkin brought the infant home to East Meadow, Long Island. 3 years after that, they adopted a daughter named January. To neighbors and acquaintances, the Rifkins appeared to be a typical middle-class family, raising 2 children in suburban comfort. But inside that household, Joel was struggling in ways that would shape the rest of his life. School became a daily exercise in humiliation. Rifkin suffered from dyslexia and other learning disabilities that made academics frustrating and success elusive. His classmates noticed his difficulties and responded with relentless torment. They mocked his stutter. They ridiculed his appearance. They excluded him from social circles and made him the target of jokes he could never escape. By the time he graduated from East Meadow High School in 1977, Rifkin had internalized a deep resentment toward the world that had rejected him. He enrolled in several colleges over the following years, but never completed a degree, drifting between institutions without finding purpose or belonging. After abandoning higher education, Rifkin started a landscaping business that barely sustained itself. He lived at home with his mother and sister, spending most of his time alone, nurturing dark fantasies that grew more consuming with each passing year. In 1987, his father took his own life after battling illness for months. The loss deepened Rifkin's isolation, removing one of the few stable figures in his world. By his late 20s, he was spending increasing amounts of time cruising the streets of New York City, watching women, following them, learning their patterns. Everything changed in March 1989. Rifkin picked up a 25-year-old woman named Heidi Bulsch, who went by the street name Susie. He brought her to his mother's house while his family was away. After their encounter, something inside him snapped. He attacked Bulsch with an artillery shell he had purchased at a flea market, striking her more than 20 times. When she tried to stand, he strangled her. Then he carried her body to the basement. A golfer found the can days later, but authorities had no way to identify the victim or the person responsible. Rifkin later described feeling a sense of relief after that first act, as though he had satisfied an urge that had been building for years. But the relief didn't last. Within months, he was hunting again. His second victim was Julie Blackbird in July 1989. Over the next 4 years, 15 more women would lose their lives to Rifkin's compulsion. His pattern remained consistent. He would drive through areas of Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens where women engaged in street work. He would offer money, provide transportation, sometimes drugs. Once alone with his victims, he would strangle them, sometimes after first attacking them with blunt objects. Still others he wrapped in tarps and left in remote wooded areas or roadside ditches. The women Rifkin targeted shared vulnerability. Most struggled with addiction. Many lived on the margins of society where disappearances rarely triggered immediate investigations. Rifkin understood this dynamic and exploited it. When families did report their loved ones missing, police often dismissed the cases as runaways or assumed the women would eventually return. No task force formed. No pattern was recognized. For 4 years, Rifkin operated with near impunity, storing bodies in his mother's garage, using her car to transport remains, all while maintaining his facade as a quiet, harmless landscaper who lived at home and kept to himself. His final victim was Tiffany Bresciani, a 22-year-old from Louisiana who had moved to New York, hoping to become an actress or singer. Addiction derailed those dreams, and she turned to dancing and street work to survive. On June 24, 1993, Rifkin picked her up in Manhattan. He ended her life in a parking lot, then drove her body back to his mother's home in East Meadow. For 3 days, Bresciani's remains sat in a wheelbarrow in the garage while Rifkin waited for the right moment to dispose of her. On June 28th, he loaded the body into his truck and headed north, planning to dump her in a remote location upstate. At 3:15 in the morning, New York State Troopers Sean Ruan and Deborah Spargaran noticed Rifkin's Mazda pickup driving on the Southern State Parkway without a rear license plate. They activated their lights and sirens, expecting a routine stop. Instead, Rifkin accelerated, leading them on a chase that lasted 20 to 25 minutes before he crashed into a light pole near the intersection of Old Country Road and Washington Avenue. When troopers approached the disabled vehicle, an overwhelming stench greeted them. Inside the cargo bed, wrapped in tarp, was Tiffany Bresciani. At the police station, Rifkin initially claimed he had no knowledge of how the body got there. Within hours, that story crumbled. He admitted to ending Bresciani's life. Then, in a confession that shocked investigators, he revealed 16 additional victims. He provided details about where he had placed the bodies, how he had ended their lives, and in some cases, personal items he had kept as trophies. A search of his mother's home uncovered a collection of driver's licenses, jewelry, clothing, library cards, and credit cards belonging to his victims. Investigators found a blood-stained wheelbarrow, a chainsaw, and other tools Rifkin had used for disposal. The Rifkin task force spent months locating and identifying remains. Ultimately, 15 of his 17 victims were recovered and identified. 2, including his second victim, Julie Blackbird, have never been found. In June 1994, Rifkin received his first life sentence for Bresciani's case. Additional convictions followed, and by 1996, he had been sentenced to 203 years in prison. His earliest possible parole date is set for the year 2197, when he would be 238 years old. Rifkin remains incarcerated at Clinton Correctional Facility in New York. In prison interviews over the years, he has described his compulsion to end lives as an addiction he couldn't control. He compared it to smoking or substance dependency, explaining that he viewed his victims not as people but as objects. When asked if he would have continued, he admitted that yes, there likely would have been others if not for that missing license plate. The case of Joel Rifkin exposed systemic failures in how society responds when marginalized people disappear. It revealed how someone operating in plain sight can commit unthinkable acts for years without detection. And it left behind families who spent decades without answers. 17 women whose lives were reduced to a serial number in a case file. And a community forever changed by the knowledge that their quiet neighbor was capable of such horror. Thomas Dillon. He drove past them every day. Joggers on country roads, fishermen at quiet streams, hunters disappearing into the woods at dawn. Most people see neighbors. Thomas Dillon saw targets. In rural Ohio, where folks trust the man in the pickup truck waving from his driveway, where everyone knows the local draftsman who works at the water department. Nobody imagined that the polite college graduate cruising the back roads was deciding who would live and who would die based on nothing more than convenience. Thomas Lee Dillon was born on July 9, 1950, in Canton, Ohio. His father passed away when Thomas was only 15 months old, leaving his mother to raise him alone. Years later, when psychologists interviewed Dillon, he described his mother as emotionally distant, someone who never hugged him, never kissed him, never told him she loved him. Whether this coldness shaped what he became, or simply provided him an excuse, remains an open question. What is certain is that by his teenage years, Dillon had discovered something that made him feel powerful, taking life. He started with animals. In his bedroom, Dillon kept a calendar where he meticulously recorded every creature he ended, hundreds of them. His friends knew him as someone who loved hunting, someone who bragged about his skill with firearms. They even gave him a nickname, Killer, but they thought it was just about his prowess in the woods. They had no idea the nickname would one day become literal. Dillon attended Ohio State University and graduated in 1972 with a degree in journalism. He married, had a son, and secured steady employment as a draftsman at the Canton, Ohio Waterworks, where he would work for 12 years. To everyone in his life, he seemed unremarkable. He lived in the small town of Magnolia with his family. He went to work. He pursued his hobbies. Psychologists would later discover that Dillon had an IQ of 135, placing him in the superior range of intelligence. But that intelligence manifested in dark fantasies rather than legitimate ambition. Dillon would drive for hours through southeastern Ohio, lost in elaborate daydreams where he reimagined himself as someone important. Sometimes he was a multimillionaire. Other times he was a scientist who had cured diseases. Frequently, he envisioned himself as a special forces soldier hunting enemy combatants through hostile territory. These delusions provided an escape from a life that felt ordinary and meaningless. And somewhere during those long drives through empty countryside, the fantasies stopped being enough. On April 1st, 1989, 35-year-old Donald Welling went for a jog near his home in Tuscarawas County. He was known for being kind and carefree, someone who enjoyed staying active. A jogger found his body on the side of the road, about half a mile from his house. He had been shot with a high-powered rifle. The bullet passed through his arm into his chest. Police found no signs of struggle at his home, and initially wondered if this was a hunting accident or something more sinister. Without additional evidence, the case went cold. 19 months passed before Dillon struck again. On November 10, 1990, 21-year-old Jamie Paxton woke before dawn, excited about Ohio's bow hunting season. The steel worker lived with his parents in Bannock County and had plans to spend the day in the woods hoping to bag a deer. He never came home. His body was discovered in a field, shot by a high-powered rifle. His mother, Jean Paxton, was devastated. She wrote a heartbreaking letter to the local newspaper, published in hopes that perhaps her son's death had been an accident, asking whoever was responsible to explain why her boy had to die. Dillon read that letter, and he responded to it. In his reply, he stated with chilling clarity that he had no remorse for ending Jamie's life. He killed the young man simply because Jamie happened to be in his field of vision at that moment. The newspaper never published Dillon's response, but investigators kept it, hoping it might someday help identify the person responsible. 18 days after Jamie Paxton died, Kevin Loring became the third victim. The 30-year-old from Duxbury, Massachusetts, had traveled to Ohio to visit relatives and hunt with family members. Dillon later bragged to investigators that he shot Loring directly between the eyes, demonstrating his skill. Authorities initially classified Loring's demise as a hunting accident. Nobody yet recognized the pattern emerging across multiple counties. On March 14, 1992, 48-year-old Claude Hawkins finished his midnight shift at Pittsburgh Plate and Glass Company and decided to go fishing at his favorite spot below Wills Creek Dam. The married father of 4 was found shot in the back at close range. Because Hawkins was on federal property, the FBI joined the investigation. That's when everything changed. Ballistics analysis connected Hawkins's case to previous incidents, and investigators realized they were hunting a serial killer. 10 days after a task force meeting about the connected cases, Dillon struck again. Gary Bradley, a 44-year-old steelworker from Williamstown, West Virginia, was fishing in Noble County when Dillon shot him twice in the back. Bradley left behind a wife and 3 children. With 5 deaths across 5 counties, law enforcement finally understood the scope of what they were facing. Someone was driving the rural backroads of southeastern Ohio and ending lives at random. The FBI developed a profile of the killer, a white male, at least 30 years old, with at least a high school education. In August 1992, investigators held a press conference, hoping public tips would generate leads. The media coverage reached Richard Fry, one of Dillon's high school friends. Fry had noticed increasingly troubling behavior from Dillon over the years. Dillon would shoot out store windows, street signs, and cars for no apparent reason. When Fry saw the FBI profile, something clicked. He contacted Detective Sergeant Walter Wilson and suggested they investigate his friend. Officers began surveillance on Dillon in August 1992. They watched him drive hundreds of miles through rural counties. They observed him burning buildings and harming animals. They discovered he had been arrested earlier that year for possessing illegal silencers and had received probation. Records showed Dillon had been off work on the days when all 5 victims died. The circumstantial evidence was mounting, but investigators needed more before making an arrest. On November 27, 1992, police took Dillon into custody. When confronted with the overwhelming evidence, he eventually confessed to all 5 cases. When investigators asked why he targeted complete strangers, Dillon gave an answer that still haunts everyone who worked the case. They were just there, he explained. Wrong place, wrong time. No feelings whatsoever. During interviews, Dillon revealed disturbing details about his psychology. After ending lives, he became fascinated with his victims. He traveled to Kevin Loring's hometown in Massachusetts to read old newspaper articles about the man he had shot. He visited the graves of people he had ended. He researched their backgrounds, learning who they were only after making sure they would never be anything again. A psychologist who examined Dillon described him as frighteningly normal in presentation, someone you would never pick out of a crowd, despite an intelligence that placed him far above average. On July 12, 1993, Dillon pleaded guilty to 5 counts of aggravated homicide. He received 5 consecutive sentences of 30 years to life, totaling 150 years minimum. He was sent to the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville, the very place he had publicly stated he feared. Families of his victims had circulated petitions asking that he be sent there specifically, and over 8,000 Ohioans signed them. The state honored their request. Thomas Dillon never expressed genuine remorse for what he had done. When asked about his victims, he compared ending their lives to shooting bottles at a dump. On October 21, 2011, Dillon passed away at age 61 in the prison medical wing after an unspecified illness. He had spent nearly 2 decades incarcerated, and his passing brought little comfort to the families, still mourning the men whose only mistake was being visible to someone who saw humans as nothing more than moving targets. Lois Reese. She brought cookies to bowling league. She ran a daycare from her home where neighborhood children learned and played. Everyone in Blooming Prairie knew her smile, the way she'd wave from her Cadillac Escalade, always ready with a kind word or a favor. Can someone bake Christmas treats for grandchildren one day and commit unthinkable acts the next? How does a grandmother of 5 transform from the person everyone trusts into someone authorities across 3 states are desperately hunting? Lois Ann Reese was born on February 28, 1962, in Rochester, Minnesota. She grew up as the youngest of 5 siblings in a household marked by tension and instability. Her mother, Donna, struggled with hoarding disorder, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder. The condition made the home environment chaotic, and Lois grew ashamed to invite friends over during her high school years. Her father, William Witter, worked as an IBM engineer, but was described by those who knew him as emotionally distant and frugal to a fault. In this environment of mental illness and emotional neglect, Lois and her siblings formed tight bonds with each other, becoming their own support system when the adults in their lives provided little stability. Lois dropped out of Mayo High School during her junior year. At just 20 years old, she married David Reese, a fellow Rochester native who had served in the United States Navy and was stationed in San Diego. The couple settled back in Rochester after David completed his military service and built what appeared to be a stable family life together. They had 3 children and eventually moved 40 miles south to the tiny town of Blooming Prairie, population under 2,000. David opened the Prairie Wax Worm Farm, raising bait for fishermen. Lois established a daycare in their home, caring for local children while raising her own. The couple became fixtures in their community, regulars at the Servicemen's Club, where they'd eat dinner together, friendly faces everyone recognized and trusted. But Lois harbored a secret that was slowly consuming her life. She had developed a serious gambling addiction, spending hours and thousands of dollars at casinos throughout Iowa and Minnesota. The Diamond Joe Casino in Northwood, Iowa, became her regular haunt. Friends who knew about her habit nicknamed her Losing Streak Lois because she rarely won, yet she couldn't stop returning. Documents would later reveal that in 2015, she stole over $100,000 from her disabled sister to fund her compulsion. The addiction created enormous financial pressure, draining accounts and straining relationships. Yet, to neighbors in Blooming Prairie, she remained the sweet grandmother who brought homemade treats and always had time to chat. On March 11, 2018, that carefully constructed facade shattered forever. Lois later claimed that she and David, her husband of 35 years, got into an argument after leaving their grandson's basketball game. According to her account, the fight escalated until David handed her a loaded .22 caliber handgun and told her to end her own life, adding that she should get it right this time. Lois had attempted to take her life previously, making David's words particularly cutting. Instead of following his command, she turned the weapon on him and fired twice, hitting him directly in the heart. After shooting her husband, Lois laid down beside his body. She closed his eyes gently and covered him with a blanket, as though tucking him in for sleep. She positioned towels around the bathroom where he lay, attempting to contain the smell of decomposition. Then she opened a window, walked out of the house, and drove away. Over the next several days, she forged David's signature on 3 checks and transferred approximately $11,000 from his business accounts into accounts she could access. When employees at the waxworm farm noticed David's absence and couldn't reach either of them, they called police. On March 23rd, officers conducting a welfare check discovered David's body. Lois was nowhere to be found. Security cameras tracked her movements south. She stopped at casinos along the way, feeding her addiction even as investigators began searching for her. She drove her white Cadillac Escalade all the way to Fort Myers Beach, Florida, where she checked into a rental property and began frequenting local bars and restaurants. That's where she met 59-year-old Pamela Hutchinson. Pamela had traveled to Florida to help a friend scatter her late husband's ashes. She was on vacation, enjoying the sunshine and ocean breeze, when Lois approached her. The two women bore remarkable similarities. They shared the same hair color, similar skin complexion, and comparable body type. Surveillance footage captured them drinking and eating together over several days, appearing to be fast friends. Pamela had no idea she had been selected for a specific reason. On April 5th or 6th, 2018, Lois shot Pamela twice in her rental condo, once in the side and once in the heart. She used the same .22 caliber weapon she had used on David. After ending Pamela's life, she covered the body with a blanket or towel, turned the air conditioning down to slow decomposition, and stole everything that identified her victim. She took Pamela's bank cards, driver's license, car keys, and her white Acura TL. Maintenance workers discovered Pamela's body on April 9th while investigating a water leak in the building. Lois was now driving Pamela's car, using Pamela's identification, and withdrawing money from Pamela's bank accounts. She traveled to Louisiana, where she stopped at a casino, hit a $1,500 jackpot, and inexplicably used her own identification to collect the winnings. The addiction was so powerful that she risked exposure for the thrill of claiming her prize. Law enforcement tracked her movements through casino surveillance, ATM withdrawals, and hotel check-ins. She was heading toward Mexico. On April 19, 2018, United States Marshals and local law enforcement located Lois sitting alone at a restaurant called Sea Ranch in South Padre Island, Texas, just 27 miles from the Mexican border. She was having a drink when officers approached. They arrested her without incident. In her nearby motel room, investigators found 2 handguns, latex gloves, duct tape, and items belonging to Pamela Hutchinson. They also found evidence suggesting Lois had befriended another woman in Texas named Bernadette Mathis. Authorities believe Mathis was being targeted as Lois's next victim, another identity to steal, another person who could help her disappear across the border. In December 2019, Lois pleaded guilty in Florida to the homicide of Pamela Hutchinson. In exchange for avoiding execution, she admitted to shooting her victim and stealing her identity. The court sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In August 2020, she pleaded guilty in Minnesota to ending her husband's life. At her sentencing hearing, she addressed the court with emotion. "My life without David is my sentence," she said. "My heart will always be his. I should have never taken him from his children and grandchildren." The court handed down another life sentence. Today, Lois Reese is 62 years old and imprisoned at the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Shakopee, the state's only women's prison. She speaks publicly about her crimes for the first time in the HBO documentary series I'm Not a Monster, The Lois Reese Murders. Her case continues to baffle those who knew her. How does someone bake cookies for grandchildren and then commit acts so calculated? Friends describe her as having a split personality, someone who could be genuinely kind one moment and something else entirely the next. The woman Blooming Prairie trusted turned out to be someone nobody really knew at all. Aileen Wuornos. Society decides early who deserves compassion and who doesn't. Born on a leap year day that only exists once every 4 years, Aileen Wuornos seemed destined to occupy spaces the world preferred to ignore. How many times can someone be discarded before they discard others? How long can a person survive on the margins before the margins become all they know? Aileen Carol Wuornos arrived on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. Her father, Leo Pittman, was a convicted child predator who never met his daughter. He took his own life in a Kansas prison when Aileen was 13. Her mother, Diane, abandoned Aileen and her older brother Keith when Aileen was barely 4 years old, leaving them with their maternal grandparents. What followed was a childhood marked by instability and harm. Aileen later reported that her grandfather had been inappropriate with her, while her grandmother struggled with alcohol dependency. By age 11, Aileen was trading favors for cigarettes, beer, and money. At 14, she became pregnant, allegedly by one of her grandfather's adult friends. The child was given up for adoption immediately after birth. Shortly thereafter, her grandparents removed her from their home. At 14 years old, Aileen Wuornos was living in the woods or hitchhiking across the country, surviving however she could. The world had finished with her before she even had a chance to begin. For the next 15 years, Wuornos drifted through Florida, accumulating arrest after arrest. Her record included charges for driving under the influence, assault, armed robbery, forgery, and illegal possession of firearms. Police reports frequently noted her demeanor as confrontational and unstable. She supported herself through street work along Florida's highways, serving primarily middle-aged men seeking brief encounters. It was dangerous, degrading work that placed her in situations where violence was always possible. Nobody was looking out for her. Nobody was checking if she made it home each night. In 1986, everything changed when she met Tyria Moore at a bar in Daytona Beach. The two women began an intense romantic partnership that would last nearly 5 years. For perhaps the first time in her life, Wuornos had someone who mattered to her, someone who stayed. She and Moore lived together, with Wuornos continuing her street work to pay their expenses. They sold stolen items at local pawn shops. They moved frequently. And then, in late 1989, the pattern shifted into something far darker. On November 30th, 1989, 51-year-old Richard Mallory closed his electronics repair shop in Palm Harbor and drove toward Volusia County. He picked up Wuornos along the way. The next day, his car was discovered, abandoned with his wallet, some personal items, and an empty vodka bottle inside. 2 weeks later, his body was found in a Daytona Beach area with multiple gunshot wounds. Wuornos later claimed that Mallory had become aggressive during their encounter, forcing himself on her, and that she shot him in self-defense. What police didn't discover until years later was that Mallory had served a decade in prison for a previous violent assault, lending some weight to her account. But Wuornos didn't stop. Over the following year, 6 more men died under remarkably similar circumstances. David Spears, a 43-year-old construction worker, was found in June 1990. Charles Cascadon, a 40-year-old part-time rodeo worker, followed days later. Troy Burress, a 50-year-old salesman, was discovered in August. Charles Humphreys, a retired police chief, was found in September. Walter Antonio, a 60-year-old trucker, became her 6th confirmed victim in November. All were shot multiple times with a .22 caliber weapon. All were robbed. Their vehicles were stolen and later abandoned. Their bodies were left in wooded areas along highways throughout central Florida. Law enforcement began connecting the cases through ballistics and pattern analysis. When items belonging to victims showed up at local pawn shops, investigators traced thumbprints on receipts directly to Wuornos. On January 9, 1991, police arrested her at the Last Resort Bar in Volusia County. Moore, who had become increasingly aware of Wuornos's activities, agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for immunity. Police arranged recorded phone calls between the 2 women, during which Wuornos essentially confessed while trying to protect Moore from prosecution. The trial became a media spectacle. Wuornos initially maintained that all 7 killings were acts of self-defense against men who had attempted to harm her. Her defense attorneys presented her traumatic history as context for understanding her actions. But prosecutors painted a different picture, arguing that she had become a ruthless predator who targeted vulnerable men for financial gain. The jury reached its verdict quickly. In January 1992, Wuornos was found responsible for the death of Richard Mallory. She later entered no contest pleas for the other 5 deaths where bodies had been recovered, ultimately receiving 6 separate sentences to face the ultimate consequence. She spent over a decade on Florida's execution chamber roster. As her final day approached, Wuornos retracted her self-defense claims entirely. In her last interviews, she stated plainly that she had killed those men for money and would do it again. On October 9, 2002, at age 46, Aileen Wuornos was put to death at Florida State Prison. Her final words were rambling and disconnected, referencing movies and motherships, suggesting a mind that had perhaps finally broken under the weight of everything she had endured and everything she had done. Her remains were returned to Michigan, where childhood friend Dawn Botkin scattered them beneath a tree. The case of Aileen Wuornos continues to spark debate about victimhood, accountability, and whether someone so thoroughly destroyed by the world can ever be held fully responsible for destroying others in return.